So it's my pleasure this morning to introduce the first plenary speaker of the day. Olga Kagan is a professor, coordinator, and undergraduate advisor in the UCLA Russian language program. She is director of the UCLA Center for World Languages and National Heritage Language Resource Center. She's also the director of the UCLA Russian flagship program and co-editor of the Heritage Language Journal. She is a member of the board of directors of the American Council of Teachers of Russian, and her main research and teaching interests are heritage language learners. And in 2000, she co-authored a Russian textbook, Russian for Russians, for students who speak Russian at home but do not have enough literacy in the language. Please welcome Olga Kagan.
Thank you very much, Beatrice. Thank you all. Thank you for inviting me to present here. I think it would be more appropriate if instead of a plenary session, a plenary talk, we could have a plenary discussion, but I don't think it's the right genre. The reason why it would make more sense, because as you all know, I would think this, what if I take it out and, okay. Because as you all know, heritage language acquisition is a new field. I was just asked a question how I got interested in it. And in some ways, before people got really interested, it only existed for Spanish. And then in about 1999, there was a conference of heritage languages in America, the first conference on heritage languages in America. And I think then people realized that Spanish, of course, may be the biggest heritage language, but not the only one. And I'll show some demographics, some statistics later. And of course, all the other languages, even though they're somewhat smaller, they're still interested in how to teach students who speak whatever language it is at home, but don't have literacy, or do have some literacy but want to learn more, and so on and so on. Before this conference, I didn't think about heritage language learners in the intercultural context. But of course, that's where they are. If you just think about them, they're totally placed in that intercultural context. The conference program says intercultural competence in foreign second language immersive environments. So these students are neither foreign language learners nor second language learners, okay? The immersive environments, as I realized yesterday, start at the age 0 and end at about, never totally end, but kind of continue till about 18. So here's an immersive environment. We generally think of it as education abroad, study abroad. So not abroad, in your own home. So you're immersed in the language for years and years in your own home. But once you cross out, you go out into the street, you're immersed in a different language. So it's a totally different concept of immersion, a totally different concept of language learning. Nevertheless, they, of course, are language learners, and that's why we are concerned, those of us who teach, and all of us here who teach languages. Well, I'll try to move on with this. And from the call for papers, where it says globalization, of course, is important for all of us because it's been changing our boundaries so much. On the other hand, there's always been migration, colonialization, migration of all kinds that have been changing the same boundaries, right, in many, many different ways. If we look at the demographics of the United States right now, it's about 20% of our population who speak a language other than English at home, okay? So that's significant, whether it's the result of globalization or some other forces, and it was significant in many many periods in our history as well. I've chosen, I know there was some discussion yesterday about Bennett's theories versus Byram's theories. I chose this one just because it's so broad. possibly because we still don't know enough about heritage language learners' cognitive abilities, about their acquisition. So I think the broader, the better at this point. So it's a set of cognitive, affective, behavioral skills. So that pretty much includes everything. When we talk about foreign language learners, we basically know who they are, right? We say, oh, I have students who are taking a language X as a foreign language. Whenever I talk about heritage language learners or heritage language speakers, people would argue or would disagree or would have their own definitions, which is perfectly fine. But in order for me to talk about them, I need to give you my working definition. So this is the working definition that we've been using in the center, and I'll talk about the center in a minute. So we can look upon the heritage speakers of the narrow definition. So this definition would be more like Guadalupe Valdez, that you all, I'm sure, know. So those who have been exposed to a particular language in childhood but did not learn it to a full capacity because another language became dominant. But they do have some functional proficiency. I can't describe what functional proficiency. It's a range. But they can generally, typically, they can comprehend and they can speak, right? Again, to what degree, I cannot tell you right now. And then also there is this definition, a broad definition, which is very much like Joshua Fishman's definition of familial affinity with the language. Those who have been raised with a strong cultural connection to a particular language, usually through family interaction. And of course, from the intercultural point of view, both are very significant. And also, if you can see, the narrow definition kind of in an interesting way subsumes the broad definition, not the other way around. For us, for those of us who teach foreign languages and then find heritage language learners in our classes, it's the narrow definition that's really important, because students who have only a strong cultural connection but no functional ability in the language are basically foreign language students with some other interests, right? Other motivations. I was thinking that for a plenary, you need something, either an anecdote or something interesting that people may remember. And I stumbled across this poem by Kipling, and you can't kind of present the whole poem because then he goes into totally different discussion of things. But I found this interesting that he discusses we and they, right, in this way. And they look upon we as only a sort of they, and we are we, and they are they. And okay, we understand that. However, I think that in a poetic kind of way, we can say that heritage language speakers are the ones for whom we and they are the same person. And that's what makes it so interesting and so difficult for them sometimes. Because in the home, they are we. When they go out, they become they. They know that. And I'll show it that they know that. They're very aware of their dual identities, sometimes split identities, split language, allegiance, and so on. So I would like to propose that a heritage speaker's intercultural competence is basically a daily experience negotiating between at least two languages and cultures. Not infrequently, it's more than two languages in the same home. And it could be dialects of the same language, it could be different languages. And you find it in literature quite a lot. Then it's also a multidimensional construct of identity, language, attitude, motivation, and of course, linguistic competencies. And then, as I will show at the very end, and that's my purpose in researching all of that, is that I believe that all of this, the identities, language, attitude, motivation, linguistic competence, of course, can be used as a cornerstone of heritage language curriculum. So here is a short outline. I will talk about the Heritage National Language Resource Center, just because I think you should know about it. It's one of 15 centers, together with the center who's organized this wonderful conference. Then I will talk about the results of a National Heritage Language Survey that the center conducted. And then this is what I mentioned already. So the National Heritage Language Resource Center at UCLA is one of 15 language resource centers. We were funded together with you, right, in 2010, right? 6. Oh, yeah, of course. Oh, it says here, right now. And then we refunded in 10. The center's mission is, in a way, more narrow, or I don't want to say narrow, I would say more focused than the missions of the other centers, some other centers are represented here too. Our mission is research into heritage language acquisition, innovative teaching practices and professional development, and design of heritage language specific materials. I must say it all takes a long time and a lot of effort. And I also think that now we know a little bit more about, we've done considerable amount of research, so now I feel we are really beginning to move ahead. So why focus on heritage languages? I think each of you could, or any time you would talk to people, they would have their own reasons. There are many reasons, and that makes it such an interesting field. First of all, there is a need for speakers of foreign languages in general, and less commonly taught languages in particular, and for proficient speakers, I would say. With the exception of Spanish, all the other heritage languages are less commonly taught languages. Okay, so you can just look at them and say, oh, okay, in the field of less commonly languages, most of them are. Basically, all of them are. Then there is research into interrupted language development. That's what linguists find so exciting. Then emotional and psychological well-being of communities is very important. We don't talk about it so much when we talk about foreign language teaching, right? And I want you to know the word communities. I'll come back to it. Then, of course, there are language policies and politics, and we don't have language policies, basically. But we could, I suppose, eventually. And then there is the pedagogical necessity, which what drives my research and my interests, and I think many of you here we just need to know how to teach them. It's very simple. They come to our classes, what do you do with them? So that's what we've been trying to figure out. Okay. I mentioned already that 20% of American population right now speak a language other than English at home. Just want to show you some statistics. I think mostly people would start looking for their language. You may not find a particular language because these are just the biggest languages. So you can look at this. And if we see that, we look at Spanish or Spanish Creole, it's 35 million right now, according to the newest surveys. But still, there are a lot of, about 20 million of people speaking other languages. They are different languages, not one. But still, we can think of a methodology that would apply to all of them that would be helpful. And then a few more. Okay. And then I also want to show you this, which I think is of some interest. States with foreign-born populations exceeding 500,000 people. Well, I must say that California leads the way in a big way. But then the other states also have significant populations of foreign-born populations. If you think of foreign-born, then you think, a language spoken in the household will probably be not English, right? Or English and. Okay. So looking at California, it does make sense, I think, that we have the Center for Heritage Language Research Acquisition, etc. Okay, just a couple of things that the center has done for now. You may be interested in it. For linguists, there is this white paper on heritage linguistics that's online. You can find it there. For those who teach, we have an online teacher training workshop, which has all kinds of exercises, lectures, discussions, and so on that may be of interest. Then we also do training and dissemination, as do all centers. And I want to invite you all of you who are interested, to attend our 6th Summer Research Institute that will be held at UCLA this summer. We also do offer workshops for heritage language teachers, and we'll have one in the 3rd week in July this summer. And then we also, and this is my segue into talking about who heritage language learners are in more detail, we also teach classes, summer classes for heritage speakers, of high school students who are heritage speakers of these languages. Some of the classes are funded by StarTalk, and we fund some of the others. So the interesting question here is, Los Angeles is a home to all kinds of heritage communities. I think the number now is almost 60% of Los Angeles population in Los Angeles County, almost 60%, who speak a language other than English at home. That's a pretty big number. And we find all of these languages and more, many more. So the question is this: who are the students who come to us to take the heritage language class in the summer, high school kids? So they are born in families where, I said that already, so they themselves are educated in English. We don't know what the degree of English spoken in their homes is. Sometimes their parents, so these students could be 2nd or 1.5 generation. Are you all familiar with what 1.5 is? Okay, so they were born in another country and then came at an early age. But sometimes we find now that their parents are 1.5 generation. So that reduces the degree of the language spoken in the home, but it may still be maintained, okay, it depends. And then they're sequential or simultaneous bilinguals. I underline sequential because that's what we find. They're mostly sequential. And they are unbalanced bilinguals by definition. And the heritage language is their weaker language. If you think that someone's heritage language or first language is a stronger language, they're not heritage speakers, okay? They're native speakers and so on. I haven't yet seen balanced bilinguals, but with enough education, yes, and that's the hope, that we'll get some more or less balanced bilinguals. And then, as I said, heritage culture and maybe language is one of 2 or more cultures they're raised in and deal with daily. I will show you a little bit of a survey, not much, that we did in 07, 09, and now it's been published. We had 18, it's an online survey with 1,800 responses. We got 1,800 responses from 22 languages. From heritage, was for heritage language learners, not speakers. So the students were all enrolled in classes, mostly for heritage learners, sometimes for foreign language learners. Okay. So we surveyed biographic data. They self-assessed their linguistic proficiency, and then there were questions on motivation, identities, and language attitudes. Well, the first thing to note is that the total of 77% of our respondents were either born in the United States or arrived before the age of 5. Okay, so if they spoke the language, it wasn't very proficient mostly. I mean, judging from this. I don't have any test results for them, just judging from this information. The question what language they speak most of the time shows that most of the time they speak English, 59%, but still they continue to speak their heritage language, and interestingly enough, they all mention this combination of English and the heritage language, and that comes up more and more in all kinds of surveys. The question of what language they speak with their parents at home is 39% says heritage language and 45 a combination. So the very small percentage, 14%, speak English at home. So that supports it. You know, they are in a sort of an immersive environment. We just don't know how much language they practice or they speak at home. I also think that there was this plenary yesterday on the reach points, you know, breakdowns, basically. I think at home they get a lot of reach points where they can't, and we hear that, when they can't get their meaning across and everyone gets frustrated. So the question is whether they learn from that or get more embarrassed and so on. So if we look at this, we'll see that they are sequential bilinguals mostly, which means they spoke their heritage language only at the age of 0, I suppose. And then after 5, you know, it sort of the use of language diminishes, and they use more and more English, but still they continue to use both languages, so that they continue to use the language. This also shows that they continue to use the language, because this was asked of university students who were enrolled in classes at that point. So they do speak on the phone in their home language, I suppose, with their parents. I talked to some Vietnamese instructors once, and I showed something similar to this, and they said, oh yes, they speak to us, you know, those who were speakers of Vietnamese. In Vietnamese, they just say yes or no. But, you know, they get input, and I'm sure a lot of input from their parents. So that's language learning or maintenance or whatever you want to call it. So they do speak on the phone. There is TV watching. There is a movie or DVD. And some students attended a community church event. That was very interesting because it differs by the language a lot. Some communities support those activities, others seem to be indifferent to them. So again, if you just look at this, then you will understand that a community plays a very different role for heritage learners, heritage speakers, than it does for foreign language speakers who are outside of the community and may want to be inside or interact with it, but of course in a very different way. And then the question of motivation, why have you enrolled in this class? We sometimes think they enroll for an easy A. I don't like that. I don't mean I don't like them enrolling for an easy A. I frankly get upset when people say that, because I think that if we offer them a program which actually teaches them, then they cannot enroll for an easy A. So if they enroll for an easy A, it's our responsibility. That means we don't teach them right. So the students say that they want to learn about their cultural and linguistic rules, to communicate better with family and friends in the United States, which I found interesting, not abroad. There is abroad somewhere, but in the United States, and of course to fulfill a language requirement. They're students, it makes sense. For 2 languages, Chinese and Spanish, for a future career or job was almost #1, or maybe was #1. For the others, it was not in the range of their interests. But for all of them, cultural linguistic roots and communicating better with family in the United States was significant. So in a nutshell, the heritage language learners continue to use both English and the home language for a long time, maybe all their lives. They are motivated to study the heritage language to learn for these 2 reasons. Okay, and there are other reasons, travel and jobs and so on, but they would be the same for foreign language learners and heritage. But these, of course, are unique to heritage. Okay, so then the question of the self-identity. It's hard to know, what to make of this. Jean Finney, who did a big study of Armenian and Spanish identities, a very interesting study, says that there is no widely agreed upon definition of ethnic identity, and it's only meaningful in situations when two or more ethnic groups are in contact. Or I suppose it's only meaningful when you ask the question. But we asked the question, so students thought about it, and this is what they produced. So a very large percentage thought they were hyphenated Americans, okay? And a smaller percent just said they were Americans. This is the main reason why I'm showing this. Of course, that shows that they're we and they together, okay? But also because I think we can use that in the curriculum, and that's why it's important. Actually, there is another quote that I have here from Minju from UCLA, who says there is no contradiction between an ethnic identity and American identity, which makes sense to me. And it does make sense if you look at the students' open-ended responses that I'll show. So these were some examples, you know, how they self-identified. And there is this kid who says, Asian American, because in America you're Asian, and Asian you're American. The question is pointless. It's how others identify you. And that's not true, of course. It's also how you identify yourself in relation to the others. I did some interviews with Russian heritage language learners, students at UCLA. I have 30 of those interviews, and they were in-depth interviews. So one of the questions was, how do you self-identify? And my interest actually was to see whether their self-identification would correspond to their proficiencies in Russian. And the answer is no, it did not at all. You know, there were all kinds of answers and didn't work with proficiency. But what it showed was that the kids are very aware of who they are, and they're very sophisticated about how they talk about it. For example, this student who came when he was 5 months old said, of course I'm an American, and then he stopped and thought, and he said, but I could say I have a triangular culture. It's American, Russian, and Jewish, okay? And then someone else who said, I'm definitely an American, and then thought a little bit, after I was in Russia last summer. Okay, so that makes sense. So then he or she started thinking of himself in a different way. And then someone else explains, I'm more American. I think in English. Well, it's a good reason as any, right? So there are some others. Who knows why they think that. And then I'm an American in my daily life, but I am Russian. So again, you know, when I step out of my house and I live in the dorm, I'm an American. When I go back home, I suddenly become something else. And then there were a couple of curious answers. I'm not sure what to make of them, other than I think this student grew up with her grandmother, so that's, I suspect, what it is. She came when she was 4 months old and says, I'm Russian. I never say I'm American. My mentality is more Russian. Okay, she was 4 months old when she came to this country. And then someone else who says, I'm more Soviet. By this time, of course, the Soviet Union was not even in existence anymore. But again, you know, it's her family identity, I would think. In any case, what was interesting to me in these responses, a number of things were, but what was also interesting, that, you know, there is research that says people have a clear realization of their multiple identities, hybridity, their sense of, and Hornberger and Wang write, their sense of identity can be described as articulated continue of identity. And yes, that's exactly how students describe themselves. They know, you know, they understand that there are multiple dimensions to it, and they deal with that in their daily life. They're very conscious of that their identity is multidimensional and not inflexible, and they can reflect upon that. So once again, I'm bringing that up because I think that can be used, should be used even in heritage language classes for curriculum. Okay. All right, so the language attitudes are mostly positive, but they display some embarrassment, they display some insecurity. They find their ability in the heritage language a valuable skill, useful and important part who they are, a necessary skill, and so on. And so Maria Carrera and I, who did this research together, was surprised actually to see how positive they mostly felt about their language. And we had some open-ended questions. I'll just show a couple of things. Students think that it helped them make more friends, okay, that they knew could speak that other language. They think some think it had some academic advantages because it was easier to learn another language. Again, they're aware of it, and we can play it up. You know, I don't think we do all the time enough, but we could show them that there are advantages. I can help others, which is a lot of them said I can help others, help translate, and so on and so on. But sometimes they're embarrassed because they cannot speak in their language well enough, and they feel it is their language. Some of them said, here it is, I couldn't speak my language fluently. Again, this is the big difference between them and foreign language learners. You know, it's their language, so their whole attitude to them is different, to it is different. And then, of course, there is inability to communicate, and this kid says, in a way, his lack of language, heritage language, has been a barrier between my parents and me and making us grow up apart somewhat. And we know, of course, that parents and children grow apart even if they speak the same language. So, but of course, this doesn't help. And then someone says, when I visited India, everyone yelled at her, and so on. Of course, that could happen with anyone. But I suppose because the student looked Indian, you know, this hurts more because she couldn't understand what was going on around her. All right, this may not be the right place for this, but maybe. I think this is a very dangerous thing. We find kids saying, I was born in America and I still feel that my English is not at the level it should be. We don't know why, and it may be because this kid keeps being was put in ESL classes all the time. And there is someone else who says, although I was born here and speak English with no accent, administrators often tested me for ESL. So that, I've heard that a lot from students. Apparently, if you look different and if you say, I speak language X at home, you may be tested for ESL, put into ESL classes and such. So I think this intercultural education for school administrators, teachers who are not foreign language teachers, but teachers in general may be very important because this doesn't help these kids and kind of hurts them too. And then if we look at how they rate their own heritage language ability, they know that they're not perfect. They know they're not native speakers and so on. All right. What became very clear and interesting after we examined about first 500 responses was that increased vocabulary is number one, okay, for many and many and many of them. So we sometimes think, oh, what we need to do is teach them literacy, we need to teach them grammar because they make all of those mistakes. In fact, I think what we need to teach them, give them, is a lot of vocabulary. And they may work out their grammar mistakes sometimes by themselves or with our help, but linguistically, I think vocabulary is number one, followed by some grammar, not all grammar, and some grammar that would probably be taught differently or needs to be taught differently from foreign language learners, and then pragmatics, and we've talked here about pragmatics a lot. And I'm beginning to work on it, so that's why, and I don't have anything ready. I just want to show you something that I've been working on a little bit. We did a project with ACTFL to assess oral proficiency of heritage language learners on OPIs. We have 50 Russian responses and 40 Spanish responses, and are beginning to do Chinese and Hindi. It was a computer OPI, okay? So we have the results. And here is one of the prompts that I'm beginning to look at. You were ill and missed an exam. Leave a voicemail for your instructor telling the instructor that you can make up the test today, okay? So the question is, what's wrong with this prompt? A lot. A few weeks ago, I was at a conference, and there were some teachers from Russia there, and I started telling her about one of them about this prompt. And I didn't even finish the sentence, and she said, "They're going to call me?" So that's what's wrong with the prompt already, but there are other things that are wrong. So first of all, it doesn't specify where the situation takes place in the United States or abroad. Then it becomes a very different matter. Two, for example, in Russian, the word exam means something else. It doesn't mean a test. Okay. But mainly in Russia and many other countries, I'm sure, students do not call their instructors and leave voicemails, okay? So you can't even have a prompt like that. But okay, that doesn't matter so much. And then the responses showed, all 50 Russian responses that I read through pretty carefully were off the mark. I think Russian instructors would be furious if they got any one of those voicemails. So luckily, it's just a test on a computer. So first of all, the forms of address were wrong, from Russian equivalents of "Hi, Professor" and such. Then several students used the name and patronymic in the correct way, still made multiple mistakes. The most interesting things to me was how lengthy, detailed, and unnecessary those explanations were in the Russian context. These were not acceptable, okay? For example, students would talk about, well, we've seen all of that. We get those emails all the time and voicemails, so we're not surprised. But please call you back. I can meet you on the following days, and she enumerates the dates when, And then last week, I got an email from a student. So that's not from this study, but it's an email to me. But the voicemails that they left here were very similar to this. So if you read this, you'll know what I'm talking about. I'm sure you've all seen this, right? And we could say, oh, why did she have to do that? But we accept it. I don't think my colleagues in Russia or our colleagues in many other countries would even accept that. They would bristle at it, and there would be a real tension there between the student and the teacher, right? So, all right. So the kids themselves, I'm almost done. The kids themselves understand the importance of pragmatics. At least they seem to, from judging from this quote, for example. Growing up speaking my heritage language at home has provided me sufficient vocabulary to carry on conversation with my parents. But I have not learned how to speak formally to those outside the home. So he understands, or she understands that. So now when we teach heritage Russian classes, and also those classes in the summer for high school kids. And I tell the instructor that we don't start with literacy. We don't start with teaching them the alphabet. On day one, we teach them how to address the teacher, how to compare what they are allowed to say at home to their parents and cannot say to someone else, in an academic environment, and the question of Z and VU and all of that comes up. But there is more to that. There is the intonation and pronunciation that go together with it. You can say hello correctly in Russian, but if you kind of mumble it, it becomes very impolite, and I'm sure it's the same in all languages. So you can teach these students how to do it correctly, even if they're illiterate. That doesn't require literacy. It doesn't require knowing the grammar. It doesn't require correcting their grammar, because you can talk to them. They understand what you say. So they can learn how to address people correctly, how to talk to their grandparents, not to talk to their teacher. So if they talk to people correctly, then people are more willing to talk to them. So that becomes more of a learning environment. So we can play with that and not saying that the first thing we need to teach them is correct grammatical, whatever categories. All right. So overall, I believe that a curriculum for heritage language learners needs to be built on their motivation, self-identity, and language attitudes, and then fill linguistic and sociolinguistic gaps. There are many, but still there are gaps because they know so much. And why do that? Oh, I remember why I do that. So why we want to do it is of course, to enhance students' language competency, but also we want to do it in a way that connects students to family and community. So we come back to the community. I will skip this. Maria Carrera and I just published an article in the Foreign Language Annals on this survey, and we came up with this. We were struggling to explain why the community is so important. It clearly is. You just need to try and explain it. So we feel that they need to continue to be able to function in the community while also enhancing their academic and linguistic skills, because they come to the classroom from the community, and that's where they're situated. All right, so what I have been suggesting for a number of years is a macro approach to heritage language curriculum. Based on community, it could be community-based, project-based. It should include ethnographic and linguistic research. Valdez writes about it at length. It can be a content-based curriculum. We all know what content-based is. But the difference here is that it can be content-based curriculum from day one. They don't need to be able to read well and write well in order to listen to a story, listen to a lecture, discuss something, watch a film. They can watch a whole film, an hour and a half film, when they still cannot read and write. So we need to put our idea of what a foreign language curriculum is, in general, a little bit on its head, and start from their proficiencies, which are oral and oral. I think I'm almost done. There's an example of an Abuelas project that Maria Carrera worked on with some other people too. So you can take a look at it on our website. And there is a student view that also shows, one of many, that also shows that they find family and community very important for their language study. A student who says, knowledge of my heritage language, I've been able to communicate and connect with my family and the greater Ethiopian community. So I want to end with this. If we do it right, if we teach heritage learners right, it's really very rewarding. And the rewards are in what they say about being able to do certain things when they are taking classes or after they've taken our classes. So someone who says, I only started to take pride in my knowledge of my heritage language after coming to UC San Diego and joining Filipino clubs, as well as enrolling in classes such as Advanced Filipino. Okay, so it helps them in many ways. And finally, I think our further steps, there are lots of further steps, and anything is a further step. We do need to continue research into heritage language competencies, including, of course, intercultural, explore innovative approaches to heritage language curricula, and also, and this is very important, I don't think that's been done to the degree that is satisfying yet, is prepare instructors to teach heritage language classes from the intercultural perspective as a macro approach that includes motivations, identities, and language attitudes. Thank you. Well, so the question is on the attitude of parents to the preservation of heritage language. I frankly don't think that some parents are reluctant to have their kids learn or improve their heritage language. I don't think the reason is because they don't want them to understand what they're saying. I think there is a different reason, that they want them to be Americans. They're worried that if they keep up their heritage language, they may have the same problems that some of the students mentioned. They would be put in ESL classes, they wouldn't get into a good university, you know, all of that. So those are all legitimate reasons. I don't know of any particular research that's done on parents' attitudes. It actually could be interesting, and there may be some, but I haven't seen it. But I think it also means that we need to educate parents as well on what bilingualism is. So educating parents, educators in general, teachers of non-language teachers. There is some research on attitudes of teachers at school, not language teachers, who don't even understand that what issues their students have because they have this additional language. And I'm sure parents are not linguists, you know, so what they see is that if their child spends a lot of time on the home language, which they think he knows already because he can speak it, and they do know it, that takes time from something else. I think that's the main reason. Yeah, that's a very good question, a very legitimate question. So when we talk about communities, what community do we have in mind? Are we talking about the community of people who are full speakers of the language in the country? Are we talking about the American community, American academic community? Are we talking about the heritage community here, so the immigrant, basically, community? One thing we need to understand is that the language spoken in the community here, in the family here, is not the same language spoken in the country, right? And that makes perfect sense because these people live in a different environment. So code switching, for example, is totally acceptable. And some people say that it's part of, you know, Spanglish is a language, apparently, not a joke, because that's how people communicate. However, so one thing we need to remember, and teachers forget a lot, I think, is that these students who come to them, sometimes speaking fluent language and maybe having some phonetical, some accent, but not foreign language accent, they think of them as representatives of the culture, of the mainstream culture in the country. They are not. So they need to remember that there is this baseline language that they bring from home, and it's very different. So I think the answer to the question is that that's exactly what we need to do in class. We need to say, this is the way you speak at home, and this is a fine way to speak at home. You can code switch, you can use whatever ungrammatical forms you want, because home is where we can relax, right? So we do use ungrammatical forms. When you speak to your instructor in an academic environment, we kind of try to show you that you are in a Russian or Persian or Chinese academic environment. So you have to respect the boundaries of that environment. And then also, if we think that you're going to travel, or if you imagine yourself in a situation where you're in the country, then think how your code switching would play with someone who doesn't speak English. Are you going to be understood? No. Are people going to be upset if you use the familiar form instead of polite form? Yes. Do you want to upset people? No. Okay. So again, this is in a way an ethnographic approach to it. And that's exactly what we need to do. We need to explain to the students that the language is a live thing that you use differently depending on where you are. Right. Well, no, I can't really. So the question is, what can you do if you have small numbers of heritage language learners? And then what do? You put them together with everyone else. People have been doing all kinds of things, as we all have, individualized instruction, differentiated instruction. It's not an easy situation to handle. So, I think, I know my co-author, Maria Carrera, talks a lot about differentiation. And actually, if you go to our website, to the Heritage Language Center's website, and look at the online workshop, you will hear her talk about the differentiation, and that may be helpful because she it's a methodology used in grade school, but that can be applied to foreign language classes too. Yeah, she has an article of it. She's worked a lot about it, on it, so she's a good person to read for that. So the first question, Jim Lentolf. Jim is director of a center, of one of our sister brother centers. Sisters. That's an intercultural question, actually. Are you director, Jim, of a sister center or a brother center? Anyway, so the first question is the socioeconomic issues. Of course, they're complicated issues because, various communities have different socioeconomic mobility and so on. We know about some communities some heritage communities, immigrant communities that are extremely successful in this country. And we have statistics to show that certain communities have achieved very high socioeconomic status very fast, and others do not. When we were doing this survey, we debated whether to ask a question about of that nature, whether to ask, what is your parents' education, or what do your parents do? And we decided not to do it. Here is the reason. First of all, children may not know what their parents' education is. Second of all, sometimes someone may be a cab driver in this country because for many reasons. However, that person may be an educated person from the country back home. So this is economic, not so what's social, that's why we didn't ask that question. And I understand your question, and I know that there are certain communities which come to this country without much education and sometimes without their own literacy, and that of course creates a different dynamics that needs to be addressed. That's right. The second question is, and also, that would be so different between, there's such differences between communities. And that's why this certain community needs to be addressed, but not as an overall issue, I think. The second question is the attitudes. Of course, there are all kinds of attitudes. What's interesting now is that, we have this Russian flagship center at UCLA, and I'm its director. So I interact with all kinds of flagship programs, and the flagship programs were established by the federal government to address the issue of lack of high-level proficiency in the language. So certain programs, such as Korean, for example, is mostly heritage speakers. Persian is highly heritage. Chinese maybe not so much, half and half. Russian we have some heritage speakers and such. So there is, and they're all being supported. It doesn't matter how you came to learn the language if you're willing to keep learning it. So I think the federal government now has this idea that heritage learners, heritage speakers are actually a good foundation for building some kind of a linguistic proficiency in this country. However, their problem, I believe, is that they think it's very easy to do. They think, oh, all right, we have those heritage communities. That means we have lots of advanced level speakers running around. We don't. So what we need to do is teach them and figure out, it's not easy. Actually, it's hard to teach them to advanced superior proficiency because they're proficient to a degree at the beginning. So they don't resist, but they are resistant to it. you know, they already can do things, and you are telling them, no, you just have to do them differently. So there is, I think there is this understanding on the part of the federal government, and then locally, somewhat, you know, somewhat. And then locally, I guess we deal with that locally.